Well, today the Supreme Court takes on a case that could decide whether or not corporations can be sued over torture. The case involves about a dozen Nigerian activists that say Shell Oil's parent company helped the Nigerian government in violently cracking down on anti-oil protesters in the country. But the multinational company argues they are not liable because they are, quote, not, quote, natural persons. So, in other words, since corporations are not people, they can't be sued for human rights violations. Well, to talk more about the implications of this, Caroline Helderman, professor of politics and of Occidental College, joins us now. Hi, welcome, Caroline. This comes years after the controversial Citizens United case where the Supreme Court ruled that corporations are people and therefore they have the right to pump as much money as they want into political campaigns. But when it comes to something like human rights violations, they're not people. How does that make sense?
Well, this particular case is coming because the Second Circuit Court is looking at this Shell case and saying, well, if a corporation is not a natural citizen, then they can't be held liable for their actions across overseas. The problem is 3 other courts disagree with them, and the Supreme Court upheld this notion that we could be trying corporations and individuals based upon violations of international human rights law in 2004. So this is not following precedent, and the fact that the Supreme Court is looking at this now probably means that there's a pro-corporatist agenda, and it doesn't make sense given the Citizens United case, because you can't have it both ways, right? You can't say, well, you get to be a citizen, you get to be considered a citizen if you're a corporation because it will give you power in politics, but then we're not going to hold you accountable using that same logic. It is illogical.
And there certainly seems to be a contradiction there. Mitt Romney, presidential candidate, stands by the fact that corporations are people. Here's what he had to say about the issue in the past.
Corporations are people, my friend. We can raise taxes on, of course they are. Everything corporations earn ultimately goes to people. So where do you think it goes?
So if corporations are people, shouldn't they be punished for torture?
Well, they should indeed, right? We have the 1886 case, the Santa Clara case, finding that corporations are people, and then the application in 2010 with Citizens United saying, and they can contribute as much as they want to in politics. Using that logic, we need to treat them as citizens across the board. Although I would take a step back and say I have a problem with the fact that we can't hold corporations accountable unless we consider them to be persons. I want to hold them accountable regardless of whether or not we consider them to be natural citizens. Imagine the implications if we were to implement this law in the United States. Well, corporations can't be held accountable for murder and rape, and in this particular trial, state-sanctioned murder for environmental and human rights protesters in Nigeria. We would never allow this on American soil, so why are we willing to allow this on Nigerian soil?
That is certainly an interesting question. So it seems that corporations want to have the best of both worlds. They want to be considered a person when it benefits them and not considered a person when it doesn't benefit them.
Right, Liz, you bring up a great point, right? That the Supreme Court that we are seeing right now is the legacy of the Bush administration, but also the lower courts. I mean, there was a concerted effort to stack the courts with conservative, pro-corporate individuals. And I think what you're going to see is this hypocrisy where the 5 members, the conservative members of the Supreme Court, ended up supporting Citizens United, which is triple the amount of outside money in politics in the 2010 election, and will probably be much larger than that in the 2012 election. You're going to see those same folks saying, no, corporations shouldn't be held accountable for torture, for rape, for murder. It just boggles the mind how blatant the political agenda is here. And when you look at the lower courts, so far with all of this disagreement, it is split along the lines of party. So democratically appointed judges have been in favor of holding corporations accountable for these atrocities, and Republican judges with the exception, or Republican appointed judges with the exception of one, have gone with corporations and allowing them this double standard, or this incredible immunity, which is just popping up out of thin air with no precedent.
And it seems like a no-brainer. I mean, if somebody is torturing another person, that person should be held accountable. But how far could this go? I mean, exploiting slaves, atrocious human rights violations. Corporations will not be responsible for these heinous acts should the Supreme Court rule in their favor. Is that correct?
Correct. In fact, I think that if the Supreme Court rules in their favor, it will encourage corporations to go in, especially those that are extracting resources like oil or mining. They will go and seek out regimes where they don't have to worry about human rights violations, because those regimes can then take care of environmental protesters or people who stand up to them. I mean, look at this Shell case in Nigeria. We are talking about medical doctors and activists who stood up to Shell's environmental degradation and their human rights violations, and they were murdered, state-sanctioned murder for this. And what's interesting, Liz, is that this reveals that this is not a particularly unusual pattern here. We see a lot of corporations engaging in this behavior, enough so that we can talk about at least a dozen cases previously.
So, Caroline, we had Citizens United, now this. Is this yet another example of corporations and their overwhelming power, growing power of government and politics here in the U.S.?
Absolutely. I mean, we have the best government that corporations can buy at this point. We see the voice of citizens trumped by corporate money, and the Citizens United ruling has done exactly what we thought it would do. It has increased outside spending, and there's no transparency, right? We don't know where this money is coming from. It's coming from probably a handful of large donors. We need to revoke corporate personhood. We need to go back to a time in the United States where corporations could only exist if they served the public interest. Now, it doesn't mean they wouldn't exist, and it doesn't mean that the market wouldn't be free. In fact, I would argue that it would restore much better market mechanisms where corporations couldn't put their bottom line in front of the health, lives, and safety of American citizens, or in this case, Nigerian citizens.
Obviously, very huge implications for this case. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Caroline, thank you for coming on the show. That was Caroline Heldman, politics professor at Occidental College.